All right. Welcome to the Race Class Podcast. It is recording now in November 20th, 2025, though this conversation will likely air sometime in December. And I'm joined today with Rory Bahadur, law professor at Washburn University, that I had the pleasure to visit right about a year ago, the day
Yeah.
after the last presidential election. And so that was a very early morning for me. I can remember quite vividly making my way through Logan Airport and wondering why I was about to board a flight to Kansas. But but it was part, it was part of a 75-year anniversary
Right.
of Brown, and so there's a lot there. But now I'm already veering off, and I don't mean to. So, um, Rory, Professor Bahadur, um, is joining us as part of Race Class's series this fall, where I'm talking with scholars who think about race and racism, many of whom have recently published books. And so we're going to be talking with Rory about his book, but also this moment, how he understands it. And I'm just so glad to have you here with us. So just to um, start things off, as I mentioned, one of the focuses of our conversation will be your new book, A Critical Race Approach to Systemic Inequity. And I know some folks are going to want to get a copy after the conversation. And so, where should they turn to both get a copy of your book and to learn more about your research more broadly?
Thanks for having me, Jonathan. I'm really excited to talk about these things with people who sort of understand where we're coming from. So the name of the book, like you said, is A Critical Race Approach to Systemic Inequity. The easiest place to get it is on Amazon, but it's also available at the Carolina Academic Press website. And my scholarship, there's a link to my scholarship on my faculty webpage at the Washburn Law, and I put everything up on SSRN as well. So if you do an author search, some of my scholarship will be available there.
Thanks. And we'll also, when we post about the episode, we'll drop in some links so that
Okay.
it's easy for folks to find your book in particular, which I would highly recommend. We started getting into this next question a little bit before we formally started chatting for purposes of this conversation, but I'll ask you again to the extent you want to share, and I'd invite you to share or not.
Yeah.
How are you doing? And
Um,
yeah,
but- no,
really,
go.
in like the earnest sort of way, like, how are you doing?
Um, it's a real low point, right? I've been living in the United States since 1990, and when I moved here then as an immigrant, I still do love this country. I don't love it less, but I just admired the country. I would go home to visit the people who had not, made the move from Trinidad. And I'd say, one of the things I love about this country is you can actually say stuff and the government can't punish you. Like in Trinidad, we have the Sedition Acts, that type of thing. And then I came to law school and I read New York Times v. Sullivan. And there's some language in there that says, I think it's like, to many this will and always be folly, but on it we stake our all. Talking about that passion, that passionate American respect for free speech. And so I think of that, and I thought of that since 2000 in law school as the basis for like we the people. The jury system here believes that we shouldn't censor. People should be able to say what they want. It represented something unique about dignity in populations for me. And then recently, especially since the last election, I've watched videos of people get arrested by ICE near where you live for posting an op-ed. And I went and I immediately read the op-ed. And the op-ed was neutral. I mean, they get arrested, we're deporting people for speech, and I'm having a hard time reconciling that with what I thought about this United States just a few months ago as well. So there's a dissonance that's really unsettling. And you have to understand, for me, up to this day, when I teach New York Times v. Sullivan, I almost choke up because I bathe in the privilege of being in this country, right? That free speech is to me definitional about America. And then I published the book. So I've seen it on the news, it's been bothering me. And then in my school, I had to beg them like for 4 months to even announce the book's publication. And they were afraid to even announce it because of repercussions. And, I think, well, that's not rational, that's not whatever. So they go ahead and they put a post on Facebook. And the day it goes out, a candidate for the governorship in Kansas just cuts and pastes a copy of the book and says, I guess Washburn's going down this woke, that type of role. And I hear people responding, right? And saying, we should take away their funding, we should whatever. And there were people on both sides of it. But this is what sort of generated the book. The very same people who are so passionately opposed and angry at the fact that I would write something true are the very people who would send their children to war without blinking an eye if we said we're defending American freedom and values. And so I wondered, it's like I was struck by how could the same people have so diametrically opposed views and not even realize they had it. And so that's the point. I'm at this place now where I'm really hurting because everything that was foundational for me about sort of what I believed about him, not everything, the free speech aspect, which is a hunk of it, that I believed was foundational, is like slipping away in quicksand, and I can't reconcile the two things in my head. So, long winded version of how I'm doing.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that. And you're certainly not alone um, in many of these respects, particularly just the unavoidable reality that it is much more dangerous right now in all sorts of ways to say truthful things
Right.
because individuals and entities that hold formal levers of power who have access to state violence are engaged in a very intentional project of preventing people from being able to say truthful things. And
Yeah.
something that I've been thinking about, and we'll get into more of this, but I think your book really speaks to it. So thinking about um, efforts to prevent people from being able to read your book, and then thinking about the way just as a society, how generally illiterate we are with respect to understanding what this thing called race is
Hmm.
and how it functions and to what end. Because it's one thing to know race is a social construct,
Right.
but then it's just like anything else humans invent. And a separate question is, well, why? What is the purpose this thing serves? And something that is both incredibly palpable now, but is really not part of the discourse is that there are ways in which, and I think the Trump administration and maybe Trump himself as a human sort of really sort of is somewhat masterful with this, but wields just ingrained understanding and narratives around both whiteness
Yeah.
and um, blackness and
Hmm.
sort of other sort of sort of racial identities as a con in order to, just build a base that supports a political party that is systematically making life worse, more dangerous, more precarious for 90% of the people in the country, if not
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
And, people ask, why do certain voters vote against self-interest? Um, and there's different sort of ways you can answer that question. But the Republican Party is wielding race so that a small number of powerful entities can concentrate power in order to crush everyone.
Yes.
And, not just your book, but your book I just see as one text among many that helps to pull back the curtain to understand both how this thing called race operates and why it is so easy at times for propagandists, for authoritarians, for just, grifters to
Yes.
employ racialized narratives in order to, just concentrate power in all those ways. And so that all right, that's too much of me talking. We've got you here so that you can do the talking. So let me ask you a related question, and this is one that I ask everyone who I chat with because I think it services a lot. And the question is, where was your racial education? And I ask that in a broad way, but I really just mean, um, when was it? How was it? Where was it that you started thinking conscientiously, consciously about race and racism? Your book tells, a story, and I don't know if that's the one you want to draw on, but I'd just be really interested in hearing where was your racial education?
So the book tells a part of the story. And I guess I have to set the background with growing up until I was about 19 or 20 in Trinidad. And Trinidad prides itself at this multi-ethnic society, multi-religious society, and the only difference between the religions is whose house you're eating at when. And I genuinely believe that. Um, but when I came to the United States growing up, we had this romantic view of the United States as this sort of utopian meritocracy. And if you worked hard, you got ahead. And to some extent, that's kind of true. That's true as well, but in a much more limited way. And so I came here and I looked around and I said, well, who has all the power? Who has all the money? White people. And so I said, if I just acted, behaved, and acted like them and worked really hard, I'd be successful. And that was fine. I guess I was blind. You ask about racial education. I was a poor, stubborn, slow student because I came to Kansas with a 2 year old biracial daughter. And I came to Kansas and I started experiencing this phenomenon where people who, and I had, racist incidents where slurs were thrown at me and so on. But that was just racism, like I knew it, right? But I came to Kansas and people who cared for me, people who thought I was the most qualified on something, would just sort of give my opinion short shrift without even thinking about it. And then my daughter played soccer at a young age and she was really good and I played soccer in the Caribbean. And I realized that we were paying $1,500 a month to a dad who played softball and baseball growing up to coach her. So my wife and I, we said and we noticed too that the only people who could play competitive soccer, afford to, were rich kids, rich girls. And in Topeka, for no other reason than the demographic, that was mostly white girls. So my wife and I decided to form a competitive soccer team that did really well. I got my US soccer licenses. On that team, we had Asian girls, white girls, black girls, and I knew more about soccer than most of the other white male coaches. But a funny thing started happening. We would play a game, and a white coach on the field as well would, swear and be obscene, and the referee would throw him off. And the parents, who also some had kids on my team, would laugh and go, ha ha ha, that's just, Mike being Mike. He's such a hoot. And then I would discipline a girl, or say, shout across the field to a girl, and I'd have the parents come up to me after the game and says, well, I really don't appreciate you speaking like that to my daughter. And I found myself um, being sort of criticized and questioned for things they would dare not question the other coaches about. Um, and so one day, I decided, it was time to give this up. And an African American friend of mine, this is where it started. He said, you know what your problem was after I disbanded the team? He goes, you thought this was something they were doing. He goes, you thought that he goes, you would have to tell them 3 hours in diplomacy before they could even understand that they were treating you different because of how you look. He goes, when they see you, they don't see qualification. And they can't help themselves. They're not saying Rory's brown, therefore he's underqualified. On paper, you're overqualified, you're a law professor. But they just can't hold your opinion to the same level of validity that that they would hold. The starting point was different, and so
Yeah.
that got me thinking about how these processes that we aren't aware of work. And I looked at my daughter here, and this is my bad parenting moment. She was 3, she was 4, and she would say to me, Dad, I don't fit in school. And I would say, Shy, this is Kansas. These are good, hardworking people. You must be doing something wrong or something weird. Um, and as she got older, the soccer, everything else combining, I realized that goodness and badness wasn't the issue here. It was a perception that they had no control over, a perception tied to my phenotype, right? And that's what got me started. That's what got me to realize that there is something really powerful and structural here going on that has nothing to do with morality or good people or bad people. And that was the racism I became interested in thinking about. And I had my African American colleague on the faculty say, finally, it took you long enough to understand, but she was gracious and she was kind and she held my hand through this education. And I'm not really concerned with the obvious racists who think that I'm less than them based on my skin color. I just don't really care about engaging. I want to I think the structural stuff is something that has nothing to do with intention necessarily all the time or morality. And the way the Trump, you mentioned it, the way the Trump campaign weaponized that and made me have really good friends who would fight for me if they had to, listen to the presidential debate and go, well, at least he's a good businessman. She's just crazy. I'm like, how could you listen to that and come out there? Or my cop friend who in 2016 said, I'm not voting for Hillary Clinton because she lied about Benghazi. And then in 2024, he goes, well, I'm not sure he lied. They made up everything that they said. And the other one's crazy anyway. And so, how do they get there from data that doesn't support that conclusion? Is what I became interested in.
So I was planning on asking a little bit more about professional journey, but we're already turning towards the book. And so if it's okay, I want to just
Sure.
dive in more. And so again, the book is called A Critical Race Approach to Systemic Inequity. And it is interesting, this is just sort of my commentary, how effective the, quite naked, transparent propaganda campaign to render the terms critical race toxic in public discourse, how effective that has been. Because so for me, when I think when folks are just curious, they're like, well, what's critical race theory? And I'm like, oh, well, it turns out that in the United States, we passed federal anti-discrimination law. And this, like, yeah, of course, I know that. And it turns out that that actually did very little to actually remedy inequality. And so you
Right.
had these folks, many who were academics, and they asked this question: why is it that in the United States, laws that prohibit discrimination are insufficient to actually remedy inequality? And that's the question. And then it's, in different sorts of ways, trying to figure out why is it that as a society, when it comes to essentially any metric that you might think of that is a way to sort of measure racial hierarchy or racial inequity, gaps have been closed, but there's actually not that much different in a lot of ways than they were when we were a formal apartheid society. And your book, it's one intervention into that space. And this I previewed might be a somewhat unfair question, but if you could boil down your book's driving thesis or observation, either, the core point or a couple, I think that
Sure.
would just be helpful for folks to get a sense of, what is contained in the text.
Okay, sure. So I kind of came to this really disappointing conclusion, right? That the inequality we see in America um, is sort of not uniquely American. It's a human catch-22, sort of, right? And Harari talks about this. He goes, "We are really good as a species of inventing stuff that we have no proof of the existence, or things that aren't real, and all abiding religion, nation, markets, money." And those same shortcuts that allow us to not question the legitimacy of these imagined things, but to buy in and create order in society, those are actually, I think, the same shortcuts that support systemic inequity. And what I think they do, I think the human brain has evolved to reduce information that upsets societal stability to an almost insignificant level. So, for example, it's why the FCC received a bunch of these calls in 2018, I think, when Shakira and J-Lo performed at the Super Bowl, and they said, "Oh my God, this is demeaning to women. I'm going to stop watching the NFL." And then a few years later, they go, "Meh, it's locker room talk," when the guy who's going to appoint the judges to determine women's rights says the thing about grabbing him by whatever. And so I think we've evolved to not see dissonance, right? And I think that's automatic. I don't think that's conscious. And it doesn't require hatred. It just requires difference. You identify a difference. As humans, this is what we do. It's kind of like triage, because we have so much information coming at us in society that we make these unconscious limbic brain driven decisions that come to a conclusion for us. Because if we, and Dan Subotnik at Toro, he says, the way you have to think about it is, if we didn't have those heuristics, we'd still be cave dwelling creatures, because progress would be slow. And so and so that same mechanism creates like a validation of information. It happens automatically. It's not subject to introspection. We can't do anything about it even if we knew about it. But one of the things that's central to it is this work from Tajfel and Jost and Brewer that talks about human group formation. A human being identifies themselves by situating themselves in a society. And then they situate themselves within a group that they feel similarity to. And while race is nonsense and the hierarchies we build on race are just invented and stupid, phenotype isn't, right? So phenotype is this convenient hook on. If we could do it for an imagined deity in the sky, that sounds right. We sure could do it for the difference in who could take the most sun competition between you and I, right? Because that's tangible. We could see that, right? And so what we do as humans is we situate ourselves in groups, and palliatively, unconsciously, the closer we can situate ourselves to the apex group, is the better we feel. It's like a palliative sort of effect, right? It's why the lower socioeconomic classes vilify immigrants, right? Is why Lyndon Johnson said, "Just convince the worst white man that he's better than the best black man, and he will help oppress," right? He'll give you all the money, right? He'll suffer self-harm just for that evolutionarily sort of palliative thing that we need to survive as humans. So I would say the two core things are like, humanity depends on cognitive shortcuts to create order and maintain civilization societies. But those same shortcuts make us blind to the injustice of others. Right? We don't even see it. It's not like we're ignoring it and our brains aren't wired to see it. And then what that leads to is, so to overcome what we call systemic inequity, which is based on caste in India, race in the United States, tribalism in Kenya, wherever you look, right? We need more than stuff that teaches somebody at a DEI seminar. We need stuff
Mm,
that's different than, okay, let me raise your racial awareness. We have to understand that we can't dismantle these hierarchies that the brain is wired to reproduce with empathy, feelings, but stuff. You have to disrupt the architecture itself. And so that's where I kind of feel like I left the reader and myself hanging. I don't think I'm equipped alone to design the tool for repairing the entirety of humanity's reality and history. And I'd like other scholars in the field to sort of take a different approach than the Kendi moral, immoral, good, bad.
Hmm.
That's that's too small. Anything larger than a complete identification of the system and a systemic overhaul is going to fall short. So even the well-intentioned best people need to sort of get off the morality makes a difference wagon. And that's where I'm at.
So, thanks. And there was a lot there, and it's also, um, it really builds to this next question that I want to ask you, which is trying to sort of understand sort of one of the sort of places where you're situated that one can think of as sort of like in the mind, sort
Yeah,
of very individualized. Though one might say, um, might have sort of a different sort of sense of that, how that relates to systemic inequality, which we think of as structure and very not individual. And I'll say that so much of my scholarship, not currently, but there were many years when a lot of my writing was really digging into and marshaling implicit social cognition research, the implicit bias research, the stereotype threat, and social identity threat research. And something that I encountered at times was a critique that viewed that scholarship as overly focused on individuals
all
and
right.
insufficiently focused on structure. And I think that that's too simplistic a dichotomy because I think one can focus on, I think the implicit social cognition research can actually be a window into structure, and one can think about biases as actually a structural phenomenon. And
Right.
then the sort of individual v structure sometimes is coming out more in the intervention. And is it about trying to get, you know, people to behave in, you know, interactions with their colleagues a little bit differently as opposed to, you know, just shifting the workplace such that
Right.
how people, but so I guess, you know, that's a long wind up of just asking for your thoughts about the relationship between the um, brain stuff
Right.
and the and systemic inequality that you identify as defining American society. What's the interplay? How do they relate together? Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the critique that if you use the mind scientists, you individualize racism, and therefore we go back to DEI workshops, that type of stuff. But I don't use the mind sciences to do that. I look at implicit bias, and then there's this newer scholarship, especially by John Jost at NYU, that takes that individual bias and shows how, yes, biases operate at the individual level, but biases also operate in a way to perpetuate societal stability. And so I guess I use the mind sciences to explain why institutions produce inequality even when the individuals in those societies genuinely believe they're behaving fairly. I don't use them as like moral diagnoses, but I use them as sort of like an architectural view of how these cognitive pathways common to all human beings reinforce the stability of the structure, right? Like how human judgment is messy, it's heuristic, it's intuitive. How does that interact with the institutional rules in ways that reproduce and buttress the institutional rules or the systemic rules, right? You think judges, they assess credibility, teachers sense potential, police officers read danger, right? Doctors trust their instincts. Those things operate individually, but they're also tied in to a systemic sort of reality, right? And so when people make those decisions based on those instincts, they think that they're making a conscious decision. But in the book, I show how that decision very often happens even without conscious engagement. These things are beneath awareness. They don't announce themselves, they don't trigger introspection. And so those individual biases explain how people can make decisions and perceive structures in a way that mask the inequity, that mask the cruelty, mask the oppression, right? And again, I go back to, you think of lower socioeconomic classes directing resentment towards immigrants, right? On paper, no, it makes no sense, right? Why would Hispanic voters so support somebody who is saying that, illegal immigrants? And my dad had this weird thing when we were growing up. He's like, be careful of who you hate. Because if you hate them a lot, it may mean that subconsciously they're reminding you of something you hate about yourself. And so one way to frame it is the individual bias, like, will make the Hispanic family who's one generation away from illegal immigration, and if that's the case, to go, I need to visualize myself as far, I could either be close to them or close to the white people in terms of the way. When Clarence Thomas and Glenn Lowry, when you hear them talk, and there's a study about successful black entrepreneurs, the way their mind works, generally speaking, is they don't go, they go, I overcame the deficiencies of my group. That's how successful immigrants and successful people of color think. And it's that mechanism, right? That it isn't stupidity, it isn't cruelty, it's cognitive economy, right? It's the brain seeking coherence, seeking agency, a sense of control in a world that feels uncontrollable. And the institutions we see around us, media, political parties, they channel that instinct. When Trump says us and them, there's a very evolutionary, visceral, primal thing that happens that you can cheer when that makes you able to cheer and, yeah, yay, JD Vance for telling Europe no free speech, and not see the dissonance between that and JD Vance supporting arresting people for speaking freely. The dissonance should be obvious, but it's just our brains work to keep us sane, to make our world sort of, so I'm not saying racism is inside people's heads. I'm saying that cognition creates a predictable pull towards institutions that are built on the results of these heuristics that we have no control over. I hope that makes
No,
sense.
yeah, so it makes sense. And I guess a couple reactions. One is, and this is something that only a few years ago I heard, but in with respect to how some scholars have begun to think about aggregate implicit biases as measured by the implicit association test is not something that is best used as a diagnostic of the individual person, but it's actually sort of a societal barometer or heat map where you can just
Okay.
see sort of like in a community how sort of different groups are generally related to and
Yeah.
whether they're sort of effectively whether it's like warmer or colder, and then with respect to specific stereotypes where those stereotypes are stickier and to whom, which is just a way of sort of indirectly understanding the sort of social structure of a society in which groups across different axes of identity are positioned in more or less privileged positions. And
Yeah.
then also in just, hearing you talk about how biases in our cognitive functioning, which is occurring beyond our um, conscious awareness, leads us, can perpetuate, can promote stability and perpetuate inequality. One way that I often think about that is and this is sort of where we'll turn in a second, but just the dominant social narratives that
Mhm.
tend to legitimize the status quo, that tend to like be a story that we tell ourselves that is so dominant we don't realize it's a story we're telling ourselves, and the whether intended or not, and oftentimes there is at some point unintention in it, it
Right.
is functioning to rationalize how things are. And
Yes.
so you can think of that with respect to stories of, the merit and pulling and, and work ethic.
Yeah.
A society that prioritizes or centers work ethic, um, as, the explanation as to why one either succeeds or doesn't is, even if it's implicit, it's saying that anyone who, relies on SNAP or is housing insecure or has
Yes.
any other challenge at just obtaining the resources they need to live, it is because of them. It is because of some individual deficiency. And then if that is also happening at like group levels, and it is because the group, there is something deficient about this group, they should be doing better. And then when you think about sort of race and Trump and immigrants, that is layering on a story where it's okay. So if you have socioeconomically depressed like white communities that
Yeah.
also rely on SNAP, that need a ton of government assistance, don't have good access to jobs, well, one way out of, or one way to buffer against, well, it's your fault because you are lazy, because you're not, doing the work ethic thing, is to blame some other group, to blame the
Absolutely.
racialized, the darker, the immigrants who
Yeah.
are you here stealing your jobs,
Right.
which just and then as a function of how stories are, how the images we consume, then shape, the sort of associations in our head, all of it can function to render a deeply inequitable status quo, seemingly
Yeah.
natural.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just, as you said that, one of the things that I focus on a lot in the book is how when we say farm subsidy, the average
Hmm.
American sees hard-working, salt of the earth people. They see the American flag waving to the wind from the wings of angels and they smell apple pie. And you say welfare, and because of Ronald Reagan did a job, in the 70s associating one African American woman with it, we have these completely different feelings. This isn't conscious feelings. Like I do this experiment in my class. I go, I'm going to say two words: welfare, and then the other word is farm subsidy. Tell me how you felt about both of them. And the students unilaterally go, well, I felt good about one and bad about one. And I say that's not shame, right? That's just the way. So society justifies any inequity and makes it feel moral. It's nothing to do with thinking, right? And if you put a white person and a black person up as an image of a welfare recipient, there's much more favor towards welfare when it's a white recipient depicted. And I mean, we've built an entire welfare meritocracy on farm subsidy, but people can't even hear it because of the way the cognitive heuristics and the unconscious brain works. They just can't even hear it.
No, and that was, and so something that I think is really powerful about your book are some of these sort of examples that you offer, like that one where it helps you see how there's something that just, so naturally ingrained within public discourse, like, it's a farm subsidy that we
Yeah,
just take for granted. Of course it's needed because of course farmers are hardworking, but the system is structured such that we need to support them because otherwise they're going to go under for no fault of their own. But as a just a mechanical matter, it is no different than
yeah.
providing financial resources to individuals.
To
And
people
so,
who've been deprived for 200 years, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and so there's Ananya Roy. I don't know where she is right now. I think she was formerly at UC Berkeley, maybe, but she talks about how she lives in subsidized housing, and it's the really nice faculty housing that Berkeley provides.
Mhm.
But there's ways in which particular terms we associate with particular things, often in racialized ways that, like you said, also triggers an emotional affect where we
Yeah.
feel good about it or bad about it. We
Mhm.
think there's actually a moral sort of inflection to it. There was
Like,
sorry, go ahead.
so to me, the one that really sticks with me is when I came here to the States for the first time, the crack epidemic was going on. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's a crackhead, which is the word people use for, you know, addicts, right? And that word conveys a moral or a personal deficiency. But when white kids started getting addicted to opioids, they became addiction victims. And states spent the same money they spent jailing African American people who were crack addicts. They spent that same money suing pharmaceutical companies because now it wasn't a moral deficiency. And I just don't. And so the book kind of talks about the processes that make it appear that there's no dissonance between those two, you know?
So, we've got time for maybe one or two more questions, and this wasn't something I was planning to bring up, but for many reasons, it just struck me when I read the book. So there's this part of the book when you're talking about essentially one of the ways in which sort of phenotypically what we think of today is like phenotypically white Jewish Americans, sort of how they both, how they became white, sort of socially, but also what was necessary in order for the United States collectively to invite them in. And so maybe this just sort of dovetails with the question, but it was for me I just found that your book to be a really cautionary tale about the myths we tell ourselves about the United States. And part of that mythology is just erasing what actually happened. And so the
Right,
story of the United States having no interest in taking Jewish refugees, and then the communications campaign to essentially repaint, you know, these Jews as sort of like us in the sense of like to whiten them in the American imagination and how critical that was in, opening hearts and minds.
right.
I would just be interested if you wanted to sort of reflect on that or just sort of more broadly, one of the things that I take away again from your book, but there's this cautionary tale about the myth telling that we do and whether there's, some of like if you have like a top three most troubling myths or just I don't know. I'm layering too
Yeah,
many questions in. I'm just going to get
no,
out of your
no,
way.
no. So I think the book, it's about myths. You're right. But I hope that what I do is use those myths and their stability as examples of how powerful these heuristics that support systemic inequity that I discuss in the book are, right? So, you talk about, and I think it's Eric Goldstein out of Georgia, The Price of Whiteness. His book describes this as well. He talks about how it was necessary to, just for that small blip of time, to reduce anti Semitism enough to sort of portray at a government level effort the Jewish people suffering in Germany as white people like us, right? And at the same time, we were transporting the Nazi prisoners of war across Europe in trains. They got to eat with the white soldiers while the black soldiers had to eat in the kitchen, right? So at the very same time, this country is doing something so humane and moral and absolutely beautiful for a group of people, rescuing them. We are invisible to the fact that the darker skinned people who we have branded, sold their kids, done that stuff to for 200 years can't eat with them. And at the same time that was happening, Native American kids were still being ripped out of their houses and put in boarding schools, right? My grandmother's first cousin, he flew as a Tuskegee Airman. And he said it was a shock to him to come back to the base and see how white soldiers and white prisoners of war were being treated. And he wasn't even allowed to go on quote unquote their side of the base. This is a man who flew missions above Germany for this country, right? And so I think that to the extent, okay, so that's one myth. Another myth is this idea of this country inevitably moves towards progress. And let's look at Brown v. Board of Education, the civil rights stuff. And it's really comforting, don't get me wrong, to say, oh my gosh, this is American excellence. This is American morality. We realize that this discrimination was bad. And so a guy named Martin Luther King made some speeches, and all of us suddenly became good people, and our conscience bothers us enough for Brown v. Board to happen. That's just not true, right? What's true is we couldn't claim to be the moral center of the world in the Cold War when we had apartheid going on our shores. So Brown v. Board and civil rights, those are what Derek Bell calls convergence events, right? The interests of white people needing to portray America as the moral center of the world just conveniently converged with, oh, let's get more freedom, have less visible apartheid. And so it was a Cold War incentive, right? It wasn't a moral change that a lot of, and to say that, people get angry at me when I tell them that because it's so destructive to the comforting limbic brain heuristic of morality. We lean towards justice, right? Like we say, America learns and improves only when the ruling class stands to suffer. Only when the ruling class stands to suffer, the dominant group, right? Meritocracy. Sapolsky does a great job in his book Determined of saying that is just such nonsense, right? It's so obviously nonsense, yet we can't let go of it because it's key to organization of society, even though it also results in systemic inequity. Racism is a deviation from, no, racism is who we are. Empathy creates change. No, no, it doesn't, right? We had ton of people out there feeling emotional, walking in support of George Floyd, and there were no changes in budgets, nothing real happened. And there's a psychologist who said the same thing about the No Kings protest. He said, you know why you didn't see many people of color out there? Because it's a group of people who are so used to their feelings and their morality mattering that they went out there, had group therapy, and nothing changed. Now, I don't mean to be too harsh, right? But I just want to make sure that I don't sacrifice in my scholarship the importance of sort of painting a real picture with not ruffling feathers, because I believe that in order for us to change, we need disturbance. And so the myths and the unconscious mechanisms, they kind of go hand in hand.
And it was not too long ago when there was a very um, resonant discourse in the United States about how important it was for students to be uncomfortable
Yeah,
and to encounter ideas that that sort of force them to question their assumptions. Um, and decontextualize from some of the ways in which that story was being mobilized um, for like how can we learn unless we're actually encountering and open to evidence that the way that we think about the world might not be right.
Yeah, in fact, the scholarship suggests two things have to align for these heuristics to change. They have to reach the wrong result, which makes your conscious brain ask your conscious brain for help. And you have to be motivated to change. So you think about some really unfortunate events, right? The Civil War, the American War of Independence, perspectives change on who could govern who and the role that people of color could play in this. But I'm not saying, this is what I want. I want a group of scholars, if possible, to get together and figure out a way we could have sort of the disruption of the heuristic without the violence. We are evolved enough as a species, and this country is too beautiful, even as a immigrant of color, too beautiful, too important. The sort of aspirational things that the United States represents, at least on paper, are just important ideas to the world. I don't want the disruption but by violence. I want us to realize what we have and find a way to really get there rather than thinking we're there and not there.
Well, thank you so much. Any final words, or should we just leave it right there?
We can. I just want to say thanks again for having me. It's the first opportunity I've had to talk about the book, and I really do appreciate it, John. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you as well. Yeah, excited to see where the conversation goes.
Okay. See ya.